Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to this program National Affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine, John Nichols. John, always a pleasure.
It's an honor to be with you, brother.
So, about a week or so ago, I guess now, you published, I'm not sure exactly when you sat down with Bernie Sanders, but obviously this is in the wake of Donald Trump winning the election. And you had an interview with him that made some waves because it feels like Bernie is trying to figure out what's next for for progressives and people on the left in this country. And in some ways, he's sort of like, he's tried a lot of different avenues. Give me a sense of what you came away thinking from that interview.
Well, it was a terrific interview, and I've, like you, Sam, I've interviewed the senator a lot of times. I've known him over a long period of time, and it is absolutely true that he, as a guy getting into his mid 80s, he probably reads more and consults more than almost anybody in politics. He's constantly interested in the evolution of politics, and he clearly came out of the 2024 election, looked at those results, and said there are now some fundamental things that have to shift. I mean, he had his initial critique, which is that the Democratic Party has kind of lost its way as regards communicating with working class voters, multiracial, multi-ethnic working class voters, a very key message there. But in our conversation, I was interested in something else he had said, and that was that in some states, the Democratic brand is so weak that Democrats should stand aside, let independents run as independent, working class, progressive candidates who just don't carry the weight of the Democratic name. And that's a very controversial thing to say, right? Because parties are very obsessed with their brands. They don't want to give that space to somebody who is not, running on their line for a variety of reasons. They don't want to acknowledge there are places where they just can't compete. And yet, I think Sanders kind of, he broke the ice on this one. He basically said, look, there are places where the Democratic Party is not competitive, and where if you want to achieve a functional working class politics in America that will primarily exist within the Democratic Party, ideally, but that will also bring in independents like himself. And remember, he's always run and won as an independent in Vermont, that's a approach that might work and actually be one of the better responses to this moment that we are in, where I think Democrats are desperately trying to figure out who they're going to be when they grow up.
Yeah, I mean, and he was, specifically citing, at least in this cycle, Dan Osborne out of Nebraska. And so, I mean, it's sort of a twofer, though, too, isn't it? Like, one is an electoral strategy that presumably would benefit the Democrats in the sense that, like, if Deb Fischer requires money from the Republican senatorial campaign, that's money that's not going otherwise. I mean, volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. But it also means that you're creating sort of almost like a coalitional, a coalitional thing in a place like the Senate or the House. Like, I mean, if there had been 20 Bernie Sanders over the course of, the 20 years that you and I have been talking, I know you've been talking to Sanders for longer than that. Yeah. In the House, let's say, we would see some very different outcomes, maybe.
You're so smart, Sam. That's exactly the right way to start to think about some of this. We are locked into a incredibly rigid two-party system in the United States. That system is reinforced by structural realities in the states, by huge amounts of money, and by a media that is literally too stupid to entertain more than two ideas at a time, and often not even two. And so as a result, the two-party system is sort of overwhelming. Is there a model in this system, acknowledging that it should be reformed in all sorts of ways? Is there a model to create something that's a little bit broader, right? That there's a little bit more space for independent and progressive ideas to be a part of the discourse, and to have a sort of a push and pull on the Democratic Party, recognizing that it will, at least in these times, be better than the Republican Party. And I think you're right. This is one avenue where you explore that. Remember, it's not new, this idea. Franklin Roosevelt's success in the 1930s as the head of a party that included people who sympathized with socialism, who actually were unquestionably socialists, all the way to rigid Southern segregationists who were just, unbelievably right-wing, right? These are all within the Democratic Party. How did he achieve the New Deal, which was imperfect, but certainly huge amount of social progress? It was because in the House and especially in the Senate, you had independents like George Norris, a former Republican. You had several progressives from Wisconsin. You had nonpartisan leaguers from North Dakota. You had farmer labor senators and representatives from Minnesota. And you had American Labor Party folks coming out of New York. You understand what I'm saying? You actually had this coalitional thing, and it actually is one of the things that made the New Deal better.
I mean, one point just we should point out in that dynamic is that when you're talking about those Dixiecrats, they, at least in terms of relative to the success of the New Deal, their ideology was, at least to their benefit, built around an ideology which necessarily did not have the power for a political pushback. In other words, they're talking about racism. They build it into Social Security, at least in some professions that were primarily, black or immigrant, that were not included. They have that good fortune of attacking a group of people who have no political power, right? I mean, at that time. So there's no pushback, or there's not the pushback from the black community in that instance. I'm just saying that for the point still stands.
Well, no, but I think it's important to understand that in that dynamic that you saw back in the New Deal era, where Roosevelt was getting pushed from the left, right? He didn't always do the right thing by any means, but there was a left, right? There was something that was pushing him and pulling him. And I think that was into that context that A. Philip Randolph came. And A. Philip Randolph, largely a non-electoral pressure, but his talk about a march on Washington in 1940, 1941, definitely forced the integration of the defense industries. And it similarly as pressure in 48 forced the integration of the military. And all sorts of real progress there. And so I think that having something akin to multi-party democracy, right, allows for more space for social movements outside as well.
100%.
And so coming back,
I guess I'm thinking actually like one of the problems, and I guess maybe this was also a problem at that time as well, but I don't know that we've ever had an era that has been more dramatic this way. And the irony is that Sanders entered the 2016 election, in my sense, as an issue campaign, and his big talking point was, we're on the road to oligarchy. And I don't think there has been as blatant of an example of this, or dramatic, or real, never mind illustrative of the money, how money impacted this campaign. I mean, both on a presidential level. I mean, if Donald Trump had to raise his money without having 2 or 3 billionaires essentially fund a third of his campaign and take over essentially his get out the vote thing, the results of this could be very, very different. I mean, people don't talk about this. I hate to give Elon Musk credit, but his ability to jump in 6 months out, 3 months out from the election, dump $150 million into a get out the vote effort. That's a big deal when you're talking about a guy who doesn't even break 50%, or the AIPAC money that goes in to defeat Bowman and Cory Bush. This is like, Bernie was warning about this at the time, but now it's almost like, it's almost in the rearview mirror.
Sam, one of the things I would say is this is not new, right? in the Democratic Party, there has always been, and in our politics in general, there has always been a money power, right? The money power has operated in different ways. I promise you, we're not going to spend all our time, rehashing the 1940s and stuff like that. But in the book I wrote on the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, in 1944, Henry Wallace was talking about racial justice in America and talking about bringing that into the Democratic Party, forcing the Democratic Party to become a better party than it was. There was a combination of the Southern racists and the Wall Street folks, very clearly, to knock him out as the vice presidential candidate and to make sure that the party went in a very different direction. That was definitional for where this country's gone. What I will tell you, Sam, is again and again and again, when the left has tried to say, we are headed toward oligarchy, we are headed toward an overwhelming corporate power defining where our politics is, and frankly, we are headed toward a place where we don't address fundamental issues, racism, sexism, inequality, etc. There has been a kind of pushback on the part of the Democratic Party. What that has always done is empower the right wing of the Republican Party. I mean, that's become the reality of what we've got. And so now we find ourselves in a situation, right, where the right wing, extreme right wing of the Republican Party has found a way to represent the money power, and it does, by and large. This is, they're very representative of the oligarchy, but represent the money power and also develop some kind of working class base, right? And where does that happen? How does that happen? Well, it gets to right where you're talking about. It's communications, right? Taking over Twitter and turning Twitter into a platform, X, was a very, very big deal. What happened there was a very, very deeply troublesome development in our politics. I would argue some people would celebrate it, because what it tells you is that billionaires can buy platforms, right? And they can buy the places where we communicate. Now, there's a survey by Pew Research recently that showed that 26% of Americans say they now get their news, their primary news, off YouTube, right? That platform. Well, if I'm a billionaire, I'm thinking about, okay, where's my next step to influence this process? Do I give money to a candidate or do I buy a platform, right? And this is going to become, I think, one of the great challenges of the next few years. And it's notable. I think this is why you're seeing Zuckerberg and other people flying down or talk about flying down to Mar-a-Lago and stuff like that, because they recognize that we're sort of coming into platform wars, right? It's no longer about getting on MSNBC to do an appearance to talk about something. This is now about, literally, having a dominant oversight of a platform on which people get most of their news. This is huge stuff that we're talking about.
Just getting back to sort of like Bernie's strategy. Is he, or do you think I don't know if he's thought this out, but do you think that he's thinking in terms of like a third party or like a genuine, like one that's coordinated across certain states? Or is he talking about some type of mechanism in which to promote a series of independent candidates who ultimately share, coalesce around a core set of issues? And so that in the event that they get elected to the House or to the Senate, let's say, they can form coalitions, caucuses within those bodies.
Okay, I put a lot of good questions on the table there. And I want to say up front, I don't speak for Bernie Sanders, right?
Right.
Some of this is stuff that's evolving right now and that he's talking about it and talking about it in very interesting ways. I had a chance to interview him and we went into some of this. I asked him specifically, are you talking about a third party here? And he said no. That's not the vision he's working on right now. What he is working on is, I think it's fair to say, opening the Democrats up to operating on different ballot platforms, if you will, because we've been talking about platforms so much. And so, yes, you're going to have the Democratic line on the ballot. you're going to have the Republican line on the ballot. Is there another line that it's more likely than not an independent, not so much a third party, but somebody running as a genuine defined independent, as, by the way, Sanders does in Vermont?
Right.
Could you see that model develop in other places? Remember, we have a similar over in Maine. Angus King gets elected regularly as an independent. In both the case of Sanders and King, they caucus with the Democrats. They get their chairmanships out of that. They basically are actually pretty, connected to the Democratic Party, but they come in through a different route. And would it be possible if you had 5 or 6 of those people in the Senate who had come in through different routes and came from different places around the country? Could they coalesce into something, an independent caucus? It's possible, right? But one of the things, Sam, that's complex about this is they might come from different parts of the country. There might be an independent who won in Vermont who would come in with a different approach than an independent who won in Utah. Right. So they might not necessarily be on the same page, but they might support and sustain one another with the idea of being part of that Democratic caucus, but not being fully subsumed to it.
I mean, I would take Angus King over Joe Manchin any day.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, who cares what the letter he has behind his name? It's where he votes is really what is the issue.
Yeah, and I give you an example that Lisa Murkowski on a lot of issues as a Republican was better than Manchin.
Yeah.
Yep. You know what I mean? So you really get into a dynamic that we don't talk about enough in American politics.
The only thing I would say about the difference between Murkowski and King, obviously, regardless of the voting record, is who she empowers to run the Senate.
Absolutely,
her presence as a Republican. So he's basically looking. It seems to me. I mean, at least from what you've gleaned as to where he's at so far, is a sort of all of the above. And who is he directing this to? Like, for instance, in New York, we have fusion parties, right? Yep. So I will vote on the WFP line. I'm registered as a Democrat because I want to choose who's going to be the nominee in that, but I will vote on the WFP line. Once in a blue moon, they'll put up an actual WFP candidate in New York, but they're also building out in Connecticut and I think in Pennsylvania, and there's a couple other states where the WFP sometimes runs, on a more local level. But who is he saying this to? Like, I mean, like,
I think it's fair to say, and again, not speaking for the guy, I think it's fair to say he's saying it to 2 groups. Number one, to progressives who are trying to figure out where, how do we deal with this situation that we're in, right? Because we have been saying for a very long time, the Democratic Party is not doing enough outreach to a multiracial, multi-ethnic working class. Now we have evidence that has really proven to be very harmful to the party, right? It's had an impact on an election. There's an openness to a discussion about this, but how do we actually make the Democratic Party get better on these issues, right? And how do we, frankly, get the Democratic Party to stop being stupid, right, about an awful lot of stuff? And that's a hard challenge because I'll give you a good example. One of the things that I've seen recently is, there's a lot of people who are saying, oh, well, the Democratic Party has got to move to more socially conservative stance. Like somehow that's gonna win things over or de-emphasize support for LGBTQ rights or things like that. That's just stupid. There's not, even the people who are at the top level of the Harris campaign say that what was moving the votes prior to the election was the Trump ads attacking Bidenomics, right? It wasn't, all the vicious anti-trans ads and things like that. It was, it was still these economic ads that were having this profound impact. And so I think that for a lot of progressives, they're very frustrated with the Democratic Party. They're frustrated with how to make it, do the right thing, to be a party of economic and social and racial justice, saving the environment, promoting peace. And so what Sanders is saying is, well, there's routes here. There are ways to try and work sometimes within the party, but sometimes outside of it, to have primaries, to do things and that. So that's one place where I think he's speaking to progressives around the country and that. The other place I think he's speaking, and it's because of the prominence of being a U.S. senator, is to the leadership of the party.
Right.
And literally saying, these people you see in the halls of the Senate, there's a real problem here. And that you've got to become more flexible, at the very least, in how you respond to things so that the Democratic Party is not kind of locked into a losing cycle. And Sam, this is the big deal. We are in a whipsaw moment in our politics in America right now. The last president of the United States, I hope I'm right about this, I think I am, who had 4 years with a party, with a Congress controlled entirely by his own party, was Jimmy Carter. We've whipsawed all the way through. We've had
Scott Brown made it impossible for Obama. Yeah.
But it's true, and then Obama ultimately he lost, his majorities and stuff like that, and so did Clinton, but so did Bush, and then we've recently been on an even more intensive whipsaw cycle where since Obama left, we're now into we're on our third president party that was in power, right? Party of power losing the presidency. Right. So Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden, Biden to Trump. And so in this period of whipsaw politics, right, where it seems like people are so angry and so frustrated that they literally are willing to empower someone as president and then take that power away, throw that person out, empower somebody else, take that power away in a midterm. You know what I mean? This churn. One of these parties has to figure out how to talk about something bigger and bolder that gets you beyond the whipsaw, right? That gets you to, some sort of point where you're not flashing back and forth, right? That you're actually moving forward. And I think the only way you get there is with a great big vision. Now, Trump doesn't have a great big vision. Trump has a chaos vision. And it's very much about taking things apart. The question is whether Democrats can develop a vision that is about putting something together, doing something real. And I think Sanders is trying to speak to that bigger picture, if you will.
Do you have a perspective on who people might coalesce around? I don't know. I'm trying to think, if I even had close to an imagination in 2012 of Bernie Sanders coming as close as he did in that 2016 primary. There was. You'd be
smarter than me.
I know that, from my perspective, and I'm curious as to yours, what happened with Sanders was that there was a draft Elizabeth Warren movement that I think started cropping up around 2014. Yes. And there was already a, not movement in the big movement sense, but there was a movement. She was somebody who was one of the first people to come out and support Occupy as a senator. And there was almost like a slight coalition of people there. When Bernie basically took that mantle, he expanded it, I think, significantly. But the idea that there was already something coalescing, and where it's one thing where you have to build it completely from scratch. It's another if you have 10, 20, 30% on day one. And I'm not sure. It may be premature to be talking about that, but because I certainly don't see it. But
I don't think there's anything wrong with talking. One of the things is I always am unsettled by folks who say, "Oh, well, we shouldn't talk about 2028, or we should talk about." No, of course you should, right? That's what political people do when they're not on camera, right? It's just that the advantage of this show. I hope one of the things that you're respected for is your willingness to bring it on, right? To actually have the deeper conversations, the more fundamental conversations. And so I think that we do see the outlines, the rough outlines. Initially, you're going to have this race for chair of the DNC, right? And that in its own way it has some definitional power. But beyond that, then we do start to talk about 2028. And of course, there are already people positioning. There's no question. I think it's very notable that Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, has basically, tried to grab that lane.
Right. Yep.
And you can like him, dislike him, agree with him, disagree with him, but it's pretty clear that he is, he's moving more toward that progressive populist message. Very interesting to watch. You always are intrigued when things like that happen. But I also think, and I think this is important to say, I think there is a little boomlet, a little interest in AOC.
Yep.
And again, you can like, dislike, agree, disagree, but I think there's a discussion out there. One of the things that I think you have to recognize is, I happen to believe that the worst lesson you could take away from the 2024 election would be that we can't have a woman president, or we can't have a person of color as president. I don't think that's true. I think that it is absolutely time for a woman as president of the United States. And I also think that it is absolutely true that as this country becomes more diverse, we have to be looking at candidates who are far more diverse than the pool we have traditionally looked at. I think that's important to say, because sometimes after you have a defeat, you go toward a cautious space, right? 2016 gave us Joe Biden, right? Very kind of cautious candidate. And I think you'll have some pressure for that. But if you're going to get out of this sort of like, again, that whipsaw situation, right?
Yep.
Then I think you do need to you want to look at more dynamic figures who might come up. And there's a lot of folks who are talking about a run, and or at least who are being talked about as such. I hope they get out there early and start, trying to build something up, right?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that Harris was hurt by the lack of a primary campaign, not even both as a candidate, but also in terms of how it was educating and engaging the electorate. But you mentioned the DNC. One of the people who just jumped into the race for the chair of the DNC is Ben Wickler. He has been the chairman of the Wisconsin State Party. I worked with him at Air America years and years ago. He was also the head of Move On at one point in Avaz, which is sort of like an international iteration, or was, of Move On. Give me your sense of Wickler, what he's done in Wisconsin, and if you have a candidate in this race. I mean, obviously, people like floating Rahm Emanuel's name. I break out at hives at the notion.
Yeah, I'm going to say right up front, Rahm Emanuel is not my candidate.
Yes, I
put that on the table.
Would be my first bet on Polymarket.
Well, what I'll say is this. I think there's talk about Rahm Emanuel. I kind of doubt that he's going to step up on this race, because frankly, there's been a lot of blowback already of people saying that's a terrible idea. You've got a bunch of candidates who are already in. Martin O'Malley, who was former governor of Maryland, ran for president, didn't go very far. I don't necessarily see O'Malley as having a strong lane, but he's in the running, and you never know where things end up. I think right now the front runner is Ken Martin out of Minnesota.
And DFL. Yeah.
And remember earlier we were talking about these independent parties, of the past on the left. Minnesota had a Democratic Party, and it had a Farmer Labor Party. They merged in the mid 40s and became the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It's been one of the more progressive state parties in the country for a very long time. It's also, frankly, a successful party. There's a blue wall, or that historic blue wall that started in Minnesota, went all the way over, through Pennsylvania and into maybe even Western New York. And of those places, Martin has successfully kept Minnesota. I don't think he alone, but obviously his party has kept Minnesota in the Democratic column. That's pretty amazing. And he has support from people like Keith Ellison and others who are, people of that state. He's also been out kind of running for this for longer, and has developed a lot of endorsements. Ben Wickler just got in, and I think he's gotten in with quite a bit of excitement. And not just in Wisconsin, which is his base, but also around the country. Robert Reich just wrote a very long column talking about why Wickler was the one. I think Michelle Goldberg just had something, and some other folks. And so you're seeing these voices from around the country. More importantly, you're seeing some voices at grassroots activist groupings that have been impressed with him. And so I think that Wickler comes in this as a very strong candidate, and is also, frankly, seen as probably the candidate with the clearest progressive pedigree or progressive kind of background, however you measure such things. And it's that work and move on. It was an activist organizing commitment. And frankly, it's the story of Wisconsin. Wisconsin was, there was a time in the 2010s where it looked like Wisconsin was heading the way of becoming a reddish state, one where Democrats really couldn't compete. And Wickler came in 2019 after I think Democrats had sort of turned the corner a little bit and were starting to come back. But Wickler really built that in at a fundamental level, taking it down to the counties, to the cities, the villages, the precincts, really building out a multiracial, multi-ethnic party, a party that recognized its need to reach out to all sorts of communities that have frankly been neglected in the past, urban and rural, and it's kind of amazing. There's simply no question that, as an example, in this last election, on all the battleground states, the Democrats lost. They lost everywhere. They lost by dramatically less in Wisconsin. Yep. And notably, I was just looking at some figures out of rural counties. They held their rural vote dramatically better in Wisconsin than they did in other states. They also, frankly, had a boost, not a sufficient one, but a boost in their urban vote, and some really, I think, dynamic, important outreach and efforts in the Black community in Milwaukee, and we're seeing some other places. So you're seeing this kind of granular politics actually kind of working, and not always succeeding in every race because it's a very closely divided battleground state, but something that has worked. And Wickler's been at the heart of that. He really preaches that gospel. And the biggest thing that he achieved is one that I don't think people always measure as closely, although you'll know it, Sam, is that he early on determined that the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which was conservative controlled, was a barrier to everything, right? And so over a multi-year period, they developed a model for running candidates for the Supreme Court and winning competitive races. The Supreme Court has now got a progressive majority. And just yesterday, a judge in Dane County threw out Scott Walker's Act 10.
Well, this is what this is where I was heading to. Describe Act 10, because as I'm sitting here, I mean, I doubt you remember, but I was out there covering those protests in Madison, and you are like the it's not official, of course, the mayor of Wisconsin in many respects, and saw you out there, and I'm looking at a sign right now that says the Wisconsin 14 never gave up, when neither will we. Right. This was, I think there were 14 senators who basically left the state and hid out. I can't remember where they went.
They hid out at Great America in Illinois. And they some of them actually like crawled out windows and things and what they were doing is withholding the majority.
Yeah, right? They didn't want a quorum. No quorum there
from the Republicans, and they held it up for a better part of a month. And it was part of a genuine effort to try and prevent Scott Walker, who had won one election, from undoing, a century of Wisconsin progressive governance. And Walker was very, very determined to do that because he wasn't stupid. And Walker knew his way around. He came to power, and what he knew was he needed to do two things. One, gerrymander the state. Yep. And they gerrymandered the state at just epic levels of gerrymandering. And then two, undermine the public employee unions, which had been really, in many ways, a backbone of the Democratic Party, and also, in many cases, in a broader sense, progressive politics in Wisconsin. And he did both. He got away with it. And he got away with it despite all the resistance to him, because they basically bent the rules of the legislature, pushed the law through. And then when it was clearly there were multiple violations of standard procedure, practice, the rules, everything, as well as a real huge constitutional problem with unequal protection, right? They exempted some unions that had actually
the cops and the firefighters were exempted, like based upon what? Nothing.
Well, some of them had backed Walker.
Right.
You know what I mean? And also, but he also saw I think he saw the deeper dynamic, which was that these were popular forces within communities, and if you could separate them out from the rest of the labor movement,
100%, and also we're 10 years out from 9/11, where first responders were also sort of like we're still very, very much in the news, in the forefront, and promoted and propagandized in many respects. And one of the other things we got to also mention, it seems to me, is that Wisconsin was at that time almost a laboratory for the Koch brothers and the Americans for Prosperity Project to roll out this legislation, which ended up being model legislation to get rid of right to work and whatnot, and all sort of laundered through ALEC, the American Legislative Executive Committee, and this became sort of like the pilot program for a lot of stuff that we saw across the state. We saw it in Wisconsin when they tried to disempower Evers. We saw that crop up in North Carolina with Cooper. I mean, there was a lot. Wisconsin, in many respects, is sort of like, I remember somebody telling me that some town in Ohio, I can't remember where it is, some city in Ohio is like where Wendy's rolls out their burgers to test it. But Wisconsin very much, it seems like, was like a laboratory for a lot of this sort of really regressive policies.
Look, Wisconsin has historically been referred to as the laboratory of democracy. Brandeis, a century ago, talked about it as such. And it is because Wisconsin's there's a lot of complexities in how Wisconsin operates, but if a governor gets the governorship and control the legislature, it's immensely powerful. You can really set the direction of the state. Now that 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, when Wisconsin, the most progressive state in the country, or one of the most progressive, when Walker came to power, you went in almost the exact opposite direction, and it did become a laboratory of democracy or of anti-democracy. It's important to understand that in addition to anti-labor laws, which really did in many ways decimate the labor movement in Wisconsin, which were done to alter the politics of the state, gerrymandering done to alter the politics of the state. You also saw with the Walker administration and its allies in the legislature a huge attack on the university system and on the University of Wisconsin, and done very cynically, very crudely, in all sorts of ways that challenged. I mean, to this day, they're busy challenging and attacking DEI and things like that. They're constantly trying to put immense pressure on the university to not be, a source of progressive thought, and of course, a source of a place that embraces diversity, that seeks to actually bring more people in, do more, et cetera. And so this right-wing experiment in Wisconsin kind of took in everything you would see from, what you're seeing with DeSantis down in Florida, what you're seeing with, Trump at the national level. You saw it all in Wisconsin. Now, the only reason I put that all on the table, aside from just a little bit of history, is because what happened in Wisconsin with the 2023 Supreme Court election was an opening of the door to address all of the sins, for lack of a better term, of the Walker era, because so many of these things were unconstitutional, so many of these things were lawless, that there really was a space to come in through a legal strategy and upend, many things that Walker did. And so gerrymandering got upended through a multi-step process and had a huge impact on the last election. Now you're seeing, it looks like a process by which the anti-labor laws will be upended. And if that happens, Sam, that's not going to put a thumb on the balance for progressives. What it does, it just simply creates a space where progressives can compete fairly as they had in the past. If that happens, then, well, if it had happened before, if I can just tell you, if the unions had been empowered, if you had, upended Act 10, I think Kamala Harris would have won Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Simple as that. And the legislature would be a Democratic legislature. That's a huge impact. And again, this is not putting a thumb on the scale. What this is doing is saying, look, you want a fair politics. You want unions to be able to have a voice the same way that corporations do, or that, powerful institutions do. And I think maybe because of a few elections and some smart strategies, Wisconsin might be headed back in that direction.
John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. Always a pleasure. I learn something every time, actually multiple things, frankly, every time we talk. I really appreciate it.
It's an honor to be with you, Sam. Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.